still not perfect now. I still struggle, but the amount of peace that comes when you seek the Lord and He hears and He answers, and the amount of trust that gives you, just like, I have a relationship with Christ now, and I know I can go to Him about anything. I can talk to Him about anything. And that was just a moment for me. It was like, He is a personal God, and He's like my Jesus.
So hi, Brooke.
Hi.
Good to see you again. We see each other every day, don't we? But it's good to see you sitting in that chair again, back in the saddle, as we would call it. We had our first episode, and I thought you ended that really well. You kind of connected Lewis's story and how he's able to write stories that we're able to connect with, like we can see ourselves in those stories, which I thought was pretty neat. And you're a big reader, aren't you?
I am.
Give me an estimate. How many books you think you've read in your life? You're what, almost 16
Oh
now?
gosh.
We've got a huge hallway library full of
Yeah,
books.
I'd say I own over 300 books, plus maybe like 100 more kids' books. I mean, as a kid, I probably owned like 100 books of the same series. So
When you were little, I don't know if you remember this, but I think mom bought it to give to me, to give to you, which was, we were big into Star Wars. And there's this Darth Vader Princess Leia book that's like a comic book. And it was like all these funny things that, like, what if Princess Leia actually grew up with her father? And what would that be like? What would their conversations be like? It was kind of like Han Solo dating her and coming to the Death Star to pick her up for a date and like weird stuff like that. But you love that book so much. I used to read it to you all the time. And you had me read it so frequently, though, that like you memorized the words. And then you would have me do the Vader parts and you would do the Princess Leia parts. So that was before you could read. You were memorizing books, which was pretty impressive.
I vividly remember that. I've been told I did that with a lot of books.
You did. And you definitely enjoyed reading. It was something, Mom and I talked about a lot when you were in her room. Really, she would read out loud sometimes to you, and it's something we've always done with you pretty much every night. And of course, outside of reading, give you a kiss, put you to bed, which is funny. Now you actually come into our room and tell us good night, because we're old now and we go to sleep before you do. So it's pretty funny to see you come in our room and tell us goodnight, and the roles have kind of reversed. But getting back to Lewis and Undragoned, you know, we jumped ahead, I think, in the last podcast, because we're really just trying to kind of frame what this whole podcast was about. But if we're going to focus on mere Christianity, we jumped ahead in the way that just Lewis is trying to frame his argument for basically his case for Christianity, right? And so the first 5 chapters, which we're gonna cover chapters 3, 4, and 5 today, kind of went briefly over chapters 1 and 2 in the first episode, but he's kind of creating this initial oral argument. Like, I kind of view these first few chapters as he's like an attorney and he's making a case, and his jury, let's say, are the citizens of Britain at the time, right? We talked about that. It's World War II, and he's making his case of, just building the foundational pieces, right? So if you're an attorney, say a prosecutor, you probably don't want to come into the initial argument with, the final pieces, right? You want to build a foundation that you can build onto that proves your argument, right? So I feel like that's what he's doing in the beginning. He's going to make an argument for Christianity, but he's not yet talking about Christianity, right? And that's, if I think about the word mirror, as in M-E-R-E, mirror, it's, just at a sort of simplicity, the mirror parts of it. He doesn't want to get into the dogmas of what's the difference between Lutheran and Catholic and, all these other things. It's just like, no, what's at the heart of it? What do you think about that? Like, just even the naming of what he ended up naming the series.
I think you don't really hear the word, at least in my experience, mere anymore, but we say merely. Like, I'm merely a high school student. And it's just this idea of like, I'm not any, it's not something big. It's not something like that is high and mighty and important. It's just Christianity at its simplest, merely Christianity. And I think he was very deliberate about those words because his intention was to give the people of Britain Christianity as it is to them, to normal people, not to someone who's gone to school for theology or, super educated, read the whole Bible, just how you and I see it as ordinary Christians, mere Christians looking at mere Christianity.
Right. And it's so easy to do, I think, especially when you do convert to Christianity, to sort of like talk about all these things that are involved in it. Like, again, you get to the end result, really quickly. And if you're talking to somebody who isn't a Christian, like, you don't have an opportunity to sort of win an argument with them, or even if it's not an argument, sort of win them over, right? Depending on where they're at. So I think Lewis is kind of taking this assumption that, like, his audience isn't necessarily Christian, or even if they are Christian, which happens to a lot of us, we grow up, and whether it's Lutheran or Catholic, or very strict, and we're talking about the ideologies and the dogmas and like all these things that exist inside. And this happened to me. I grew up Lutheran. I went to church. My mom took me to church every Sunday, and God bless her for doing that, because there were foundational pieces in that like I learned so much that once my true conversion happened, like I had all that stuff that I learned, but it never, like, I never got to this like spiritual point, and never really fully understood, what it all meant. So I hope we can kind of get there today in this episode of like, what is the difference, really between the spirituality of Christianity and then this like material worldview that I think, a lot of people live in and exist in today. So, with that too, that it really made me think about, I guess, in comparing materialism and spirituality, we do live in this very much material world, right? It's all about the car you drive or the clothes you wear.
Do you go to college? Do you have a successful job?
Yep, all those things, and you're judged based off those things, and we know, like, deep down in our core, that's not right. And I think deep down, and this happens to, I think, many people on their deathbed, of their regrets are that they focus too much on the material world, because at the end of the day, you don't take that with you when you die. And that is a truth that we're all going to pass on from this world someday. And if our life is focused on material things, and knowing that, then we're not going to take them with us, then what is this life, really sort of all about? And so I think Lewis is trying to really break this all down here. He's sort of built two pieces of evidence, right? And I think those two pieces of evidence that he's laid out here, that, um, or at least evidence that there's a God. That, first of all, there is a universe, and it exists, and that within that universe there is a moral law. There's not just a law about how the universe sort of works, gravity and those types of things. Yes, there is that law, but there is a law of morality, which is how we ought to live. And I really kind of want to break down this word ought, because there's the is, which is the universe. There are, you know, there is gravity, there is material things and those types of things. But then there's ought, which is, this sort of definition of ought is when you take a verb, there's like a way it should be, right? So there's a way I should behave. What do you think of that word ought and his use of it?
I actually found quite a few examples of that in the Bible, if I can
Okay.
find a few of them,
Yeah.
that I thought really, show us what it means without just a definition. So we have 3 John or 3 John 8, 1 8, and it's we ought therefore to show hospitality to such people so that we may work together for the truth. So we ought to show hospitality to people. Like, do we? Usually not, but we ought to. This is what we should be doing, what's best for us to do. And similarly, in 1 John or 9 through 11, this is how God showed his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we may live through him. And when we keep going down, we have, dear friends, since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. So God has this standard for us that he showed when he gave us his Son, and we ought to follow that as well. We should. We don't, but we should. 2 Peter 3:11, you ought to live holy and godly lives. And we see that again and again through the Bible, especially in all these letters in the New Testament. Again, James 4:17. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. And I think that really lays it out. Like, we ought to do something, we know we ought to do it, and we don't. And that's sin. Knowing that you ought to do something because of this moral law that we have, and then not doing that. And sin at its simplest is just doing something wrong, something that's against the moral law.
Yeah. So, um, beautifully laid out, and thank you for finding those verses. I think you did another good word for ought, and what the case is that Lewis is trying to make here is uh, we also have a purpose, right? And if we have a material world, an evolutionary world, where there essentially would be no purpose, that we're all just happenstance, that we're just a random set of circumstances and molecules, that we're just robots made of flesh, essentially. If that were the case, we have no purpose, yet we know there is purpose and there is meaning to life. A non-Christian who I'll talk about was Viktor Frankl, and he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And interestingly, in that, so he was a Jewish man that lived in World War II, so same time period as Lewis, and him and his family were captured by the Nazis, put into Jewish camps. He was a psychologist, a young psychologist at the time, and he survived, and afterwards wrote Man's Search for Meaning. And what he discovered was that those people who did survive in the concentration camps were those people who found purpose, right? So it wasn't the people who were the most fit that survived. It wasn't the people who were the most cunning that survived. It was the people who continued to hold on to the belief that, they were going to live, that there was something, at the other end of the suffering and the atrocities that they were going through. And I think we all feel this draw to purpose. What are your thoughts on that? Have you ever thought about, what is my purpose in life?
Definitely. I mean, just growing up in this materialist society, like since middle school, having the expectation, even elementary school, especially, the really nice school district that I went to and the expectations they had, it was like, what do you want to be when you grow up? Because you've got to be like, don't you want to be a doctor or a lawyer? Don't you want to go to college? And even now, like, I have nothing against college, but there's just this expectation on high school students in America to go and find success and get a nice car and get a nice job and a nice house and go to college. And we put so much meaning into these meaningless things that are going to just, like, they're not going to be there when we die. If we go to heaven, then they're going to stay here on earth. They have no real meaning. And having to learn that that wasn't true was definitely something that wasn't easy. Realizing that it's okay not to have a materialist purpose, not to have your purpose be your job or your success. Just like, I want to go where God takes me and follow Him. And realizing what a misguided sense of purpose we have now. Like, the sense of purpose isn't just what good things you're going to do in this world. It's what's going to get you from the valleys back up to the mountains. Like, especially because we can't walk up those mountains on our own. Like, our purpose needs to be something other than ourselves, something above us, which can only be the person who was good enough to establish this moral law for us, like the embodiment of this moral law.
You had a really good example of this. So you brought up college, and it really made me think of the college visit you had at Hillsdale. And the president of Hillsdale came out and spoke to you guys, right? And what did he say the purpose was for you, the students there at school? Like, you don't have to get the exact quote, but he had some things to say about, like, you're not here necessarily just to become a doctor or a lawyer.
He was talking a lot about truth, and he basically said, like, we're not here to fill your head with meaningless facts like a lot of schools are now, but we're here to show you how to find truth so that you can find the truth. And even then, I thought that was really powerful and just had to write it down. Like, that's not what education is about, filling your head with meaningless facts, going into school for 35 hours a week and learning your algebra. True knowledge is learning how to find truth in general so that you can find truth, God's truth, the truth of, what's the meaning of the universe? Like, who created us? What do we need to follow? What does our purpose need to be? And learning to find that ourselves, which is what Lewis did throughout his life.
Yep. For sure. And so, if we think about purpose too, and we talked about this earlier today, if there was no purpose, and I think atheists like to make this argument that there isn't, and at least, or evolutionists, the central argument at evolution was survival of the fittest, right? That it was, as creatures evolved, the best ones, the best genes, sort of won out. And humans tended to, they ended up the ones that sort of won out through the evolutionary progress. And so if that's true, if we're getting at the heart of truth and survival of the fittest is what this is all about, then they could make the argument that Hitler and the Nazis were in the right, that they were in the truth because they had a belief that survival of the fittest was important to them, and that those who were weak, those who were disabled, those who were of a different race or a different religion were inferior, and they sought to eliminate them. But yet we had the Allies, an opposing side, who believed you ought not to believe that, or to behave that way, right? There was a large set of people who said, no, that's not the way we're supposed to behave. That's not good. And I think universally, we all agree that that was totally misguided, and that wasn't good. And you essentially sort of destroy this argument of, we know deep down in the core of who we are that we're supposed to protect the weak, right? And I think you mentioned this in the first podcast of talking about, like, the not preserving yourself, right? The preservation of self, doing acts of kindness and good works over self. Where does that come from? If I witness a car accident and I jump out of my car and run through oncoming traffic to go and help somebody, that's not preservation of self, right? Preservation of self is driving away and not doing anything yet. Now, some people may do that, but if you did that and you drove away, I think the majority of people would probably feel guilt having driven away, right? So I think Lewis has wrestled with this and he's trying to get at the heart of like, well, where does that come from? Like that has to come from somewhere inside of me that's almost separate from me, right? It's separate from this materialistic world.
Yeah. When you said that, protecting the weak, I thought of this quote from Ruth in the Bible. And it's this girl named Ruth saying, like, don't urge me to leave you or to turn my back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. And I don't really remember the story exactly. It was a while ago that I read it, but I believe Ruth is talking to her mother in law or something of the sort, someone who, like, I believe she's widowed, and like Ruth doesn't have to be tied to her, but she says like, I'm going to protect you. I'm going to protect the weak. And like that's something that we felt back in Old Testament times and we still feel now. And the problem is that we're constantly blinded by the devil. I told my sister today actually, like, right now you can see but you're still blind. Like, we know what's right and we can see truth in front of us, but we don't actually comprehend it and realize that it's truth. And that's something that, like, a lot of people were feeling during World War II and in really all political times. Like, I can see the truth, but something is blinding me from it. Something's telling me, like, I know this isn't right, but I don't know what's right. And that was something that was definitely happening during Nazi Germany, because there were, good people who were following the side that now we would probably say is bad. I mean, they were killing people, but even when there were people standing up to them in Germany, in their own countries, you had this sense of blindness. And that's something we're seeing now, and something that Lewis was really fighting at that time, like fighting blindness to the facts of Christianity by laying them out in their simplest truths.
Yeah, he would call that pride, and not to be confused with like pride of your nation or proud of, my daughter for accomplishing something, right? Not that pride, but it's a selfishness, right? So your selfish pride gets in the way, and that's what prevents us from seeing clearly. And it requires us to, I mean, and that was Eustace's story, right? His selfishness, his own pride, his own ignorance to what was happening once he was brought into Narnia. It required an event, him becoming a dragon, to see his own pride and then realize that he couldn't fix his own pride, and realized even after he became undragoned and became a boy again, he thought maybe it was just a dream. And Edmund had to remind him, like, no, 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 you were a dragon. I saw you. I rode on your back as a dragon. Like you were a dragon. You were prideful. You were a bad boy, and you weren't very nice to me. But you've seen the light now, right? And you've converted, and so yes, that does happen to all of us. So as we move on from ought, and there's this other thought that Lewis has in here. So looking at the evidence, this is where we started talking about the moral law and the evidence that God exists, which again, this is getting at the mirror of Christianity. He's creating this foundation, Lewis is, for when he's going to jump into actually talking about Christianity, that there's this moral law. And he's basically saying that we can know more about God. We've got these 2 points, but we can know more about God by looking at the law than we can about looking at the universe. And I know you had some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, while I was reading that for the first time, just thought instantly of our house. We moved a year and a half ago. We got to watch our house be built. Uh, Lewis is talking about, you know, when we look at the universe, we can't tell anything about who made it. And I know we know our builder, David, and I'm just thinking, if you walk around our house, you have no idea that David built it. I mean, there might be something here and there that seems to be that style, but you would have no idea just by walking around the house. And that's what science does, as Lewis talks about. Science is about walking around the house, looking at Earth, and saying, you know, this is where the kitchen is. This is how the dishwasher works. Like, this is how our world works, which is great because if I'm living in the house, I'm going to want to know how the dishwasher works. So, science is great, but it still can't tell me who built my house.
Or tell you anything about the person that built your house. Yeah, more specifically, not just who that person is. What is it? Is that a good person? Is that a bad person? Are they a forgiving person? Are they a kind person? Are they, you don't know anything about that person simply by looking at what they created.
So, yeah, we have to, but then when we look at the law that is inside this house, the law of the people in the universe, the moral law, we can see that it was written by someone who knew what right was and knew what wrong was. And to know what right is, we don't know what right is except from what we know about the moral law because we are not right. We're very wrong, sinful people. So the person who made the moral law, the person who knows what right and wrong is, has to know right. They have to be right, the embodiment of righteousness. And so by looking at that law, we can tell what kind of person our creator is.
So, um, if we're not right and we're broken, then we have to turn to that creator, right, to be made right. And really, in essence, I think it's what we need is forgiveness. I mean, I think at the end of the day, all people, whether they need forgiveness from somebody else, but probably more specifically, they need to be able to forgive themselves for wrongs. And you as you described God and the moral law and those types of things, you kept describing God as a person. And Lewis talks about this a lot, that God is a personal God, that only a person can forgive. A law can't forgive. And if God was just the law and we broke the law, then the sort of justification for breaking the law is punishment. But our God is a merciful God, and he does find an opportunity to forgive us. And I think we'll go most people who probably are listening know that story and how that happens, but we'll have the opportunity with Lewis to kind of break that all down. So, as I was reading through these chapters again, and this is probably the fifth or sixth or eighth or ninth, I don't know how many times I've read Mere Christianity. I've read it quite a few times. As I was kind of reading and analyzing over the first few chapters again, something really kind of helped me realize that, first we must realize that we can't we can't live by this law, right? So God created the 10 commandments. They were presented to Moses. Nobody, not even arguably the greatest king of Israel, King David, could follow the law perfectly, right? So nobody's been able to follow that law perfectly. And I'm again reminded by Eustace's story, which is why I like that story so much, is you really have to realize you're powerless to this law and in order to really move forward in your conversion. And this was something my dad taught me. So he was an alcoholic, and I wouldn't say he was. I mean, there's certainly certain degrees to alcoholism. He was at that degree where, again, this is my opinion. I was young at the time. He was probably getting close to 10 years old. So somewhere in the range of 8 to 10, I think, when he got help, and he never drank again after he originally got help, which was an amazing thing. And I had the opportunity to tell him that about 5 months before he passed away. That I was really proud of the fact that, which doesn't happen to most alcoholics, that they stop and they never go back to alcohol again. And so you have this kind of remission where a lot of alcoholics find themselves drinking again, and he never did. And it's really, I know why, and he was able to fall on Christianity and have a lot of really good people around him that helped him with his conversion. So, but if you look at which is Alcoholics Anonymous, which is the program, one of the programs that he got into, they have this 12-step program. And so you have to work through the 12 steps. You have to work through your sobriety. The first step, if you're going to get on to any of the other steps, you first have to realize that you have a problem. It's like, you've probably heard that phrase before. So knowing is the first step, right? Actually, I think at church recently, our pastor brought up the G.I. Joe story. Do you remember the G.I. Joe commercial? It was like, or at the end of the episodes, it was like, knowing is half the battle, right? Knowing that you have a problem is half the battle. And that really is the first step to this, is to know that, we've broken the law. We can't uphold this moral law. It exists, but we can't uphold it. And it's in forgiveness, and it's in knowing that we can't uphold it and turning it over to a higher power that we end up in a conversion that, again, moves us forward. And I think in that we find purpose in a relationship then with a God who loves us. There's a God who forgives us, there's a God who loves us, and that opens up the opportunity for a relationship and the ability to love ourselves, which then allows us to have a relationship and love others, which, in my opinion, I think is the purpose to life. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm, as you know, a big fan of like cowboy sayings. I'm wearing my Lainey Wilson shirt right now, great country singer. But there's this saying that I remembered when I was reading through these chapters, and it's, when you find yourself in a hole, the first thing to do is to stop digging. That's, I think, what Lewis is getting at here is like, you're in a hole. You're not doing the right thing. You're not following the moral law. You're giving excuses. You're being stubborn. And the first thing you need to do when you're in this hole is you need to realize that you're being pig-headed. You are literally carrying your own shovel right now, digging your own grave into sin. And before you can get out of the hole, which we really can't on our own, you need to put down your shovel. And when you put down your shovel and stop disobeying this moral law, or stop letting yourself do that, even if you're still not going to be perfect, then God, and we turn it over to God, He can take us out of this hole. Because that's not something that we can really do on our own. Because, like, the opposite of pride is the humility of knowing that we're powerless and He's powerful. And the only way to be powerful ourselves is to fill ourselves with Him.
Yeah, and if we're able to fill ourselves with him, that means he's a living God, that he's actually here with us. And that reminds me, I just happen to have a book here from Leanne Payne called Real Presence. And Leanne Payne, she's a spiritual healer. Grandpa Merlin actually got to meet her. I believe he was at one of her spiritual retreats and was part of his conversion and healing. She believed and taught in a living Christ, that's here with us, that you could pray and call upon him, and he would enter in. And so I wanted to pull out her book and read this part here, which just really comes from so she's framing Lewis. She says, as Lewis says, this is the whole of Christianity. There is nothing else. She explains Christianity isn't a covenant or a law, but it is a life. It is another life being lived in and through us. Our human spirit, when in union with this holy other, is the higher self. The practice of the presence leads to the knowledge of this higher self, and away from either the wrong kind of self love or self hatred. So she's talking about getting away from this self pride and knowing that there is this holy other, this real living God that can enter into us and make us whole again. Really, kind of it's just beautiful in the way that you think about it. Like, it's not, man, if I were an evolutionist or an atheist, it would just kind of feel depressing to me. Like, there is nothing else, but yet to know and understand that there is something more, and to have personally experienced that, it's just, it helps me find purpose. So I don't know, what are your thoughts?
I mean, like when you're alone, when you're away from Christ, there are a million things that you can find peace in, like alcohol or this, that, your success, your business, the good things you're doing for other people. But all of those fade away. And then the moment that you turn to Christ is like the sense of just peace that washes over you, knowing like I don't have to do anything except trust him and follow him. And so it's just like the incredible presence of God fills you. And that's there without us even knowing it, because God's already not only created us, but filled us with this moral law and this sense for goodness, which in essence is a sense for him. Because, like we said, if he made the law of goodness, if he told us what good is, that means he has to be good himself. And so we are already filled with the knowledge of what God is from birth, from even before our birth, which is just crazy to think about for me.
So can I ask you a personal question? Something I don't know anything about.
Sure.
So, well, when I was your age, I wasn't quite there yet, right? So my, what I would say, conversion, when I would say I was a Christian, but I didn't know God. I won't tell that story now, but I'm curious of what you could be willing to share with me and our audience now, of like, well, when did you know? Like, do you recall that? Is it a specific experience or anything like that?
I definitely, like you, grew up Christian family. We went to church most Sundays. Like I knew all my Bible stories. I could tell you like who Goliath is and who God is at a fundamental level, the facts. But I never really realized that like I could actually have a personal relationship with God. I didn't know he was a personal God. And I think the moment that really changed things for me was definitely what I would say has been like the valley of my life so far, which was probably around 3 years ago. My grandpa, mom's dad, had just passed away from cancer. I think that was 3 years ago. And it was just like a moment that the devil really took hold of me and filled me with like a lot of anxiety. I was like terrified, like what if something happens to like my immediate family? What if someone else I know dies? My family could die in a car accident right now. And so I just had like every possible moment, what like there was something to be afraid of. And it was something like I didn't really understand it. I didn't know how to handle it. I never dealt with anxiety before. And it was just something that like I had no idea how to grapple with this on my own because I was only relying on myself. I've always been someone who felt like I can do it. I can figure this out on my own. And I have a lot of pride in myself, but because a lot of people would tell me I'm a very smart person, I'm good at math and all the things, but this was something that I had no idea how to handle. And around that time, my friend who I went to school with for a year, really amazing girl, she invited me to her church, which is where we go now. I went to youth group there with her, and over the next year, maybe 6 months, it might have been longer, we were like moving in and out of the town. I started to see like the amount of faith the people around there had and the amount of peace. And like there were people who'd gone through objectively much worse things than I had and seemed like completely at peace. And that was crazy to me, even just looking back at it, even if I didn't remember it then, I realize it. And so I ended up like my friend group from my new school started going there with me again, really amazing people. And there was one day where the song came on. They have a really good worship band at the youth group. And it's, gosh, I wonder if I can remember the lyrics. But it's basically, I sought the Lord, and he heard, and he answered. That's why I trust him. And this feeling just washed over me, and I was like crying there, which has happened many times since. That like every time I walked into church, I just felt like this peace. There was no more anxiety, no more anything. And when I sought the Lord there at church, like he heard and he answered and he filled me with this peace. And like that led me to trust him. And over the next few months, there would just be small moments like that where I would be like, God, I'm struggling with something right now. And I would hand it off to that him. I would turn it over and I would just be filled with peace again. And since then, like I haven't had anxiety in forever, which like I'm still not perfect now. I still struggle, but the amount of peace that comes when you seek the Lord and he hears and he answers and the amount of trust that gives you, just like I have a relationship with Christ now and I know I can go to him about anything. I can talk to him about anything. And that was just a moment for me where it was like, he is a personal God and he's like my Jesus. There's a really good Ann Wilson song about that. Like, this is my Jesus. And he's so powerful. And so that was my moment, my
He
testimony.
was there when you needed him, wasn't he? Yeah, and I think for parents, the lesson. This is the first time I've heard this story, so and I re-
People,
I really appreciate you sharing it. It's tough to be vulnerable and share these stories, but I think the reason you and I wanted to do this is because we know there's other people out there who they need to hear these stories, and they need to know that there is a God out there who does love them, and there's opportunities to connect with him. And I think the lesson for anyone who's listening, but for me as a parent, in knowing, because you want to be there to protect your kids, and you don't want these bad things to happen, and you lost a lot of grandpas over quite a few years. We were lucky enough to have quite a few grandpas, but we've lost them all, and that was a really tough time. And the reality is you're going to have lots of tough times, and as parents we can't protect our kids from those tough times, and we won't be there to shield them from these things, and we can't necessarily fix these things for them either. And I definitely have seen a conversion in you, since then, and so blessed to have those friends who, we were able to go to that church, and we had those, just other connections that we felt like that was a safe place to have you guys, go to and be at. And then just to see you create, community there, which goes beyond, just those friends, but like the other people that you've now invited to bring in and to share in those experiences. And I do see it in you when we go to church on Sundays, of the joy that you experience when we're there, the 2 pages of notes that you take, filling the bulletin, the engagement that you have, and the joy that you experience while you're there. And that's, as a father, an amazing thing to see. On Christmas, you brought tears to my eye as you worship. And how many 15-year-olds put their hands in the air and worship during the service. So it was pretty cool. So thank you for sharing that story. We'll have more stories to come on the Undragoned podcast. And are you ready to conclude episode 2?
Yeah, let's do it.
Come with episode 3 and really dive into what Christianity is all about.